The stage lights at the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago were still burning hot when Howard Lincoln stepped up to the microphone, and in that single moment, the entire future of gaming tilted on its axis. The Nintendo lawyer, a man known for his polished suits and his iron grip on the company's legal strategy, began to read a statement that would detonate a partnership years in the making. He announced that Nintendo had signed a deal with Philips, a Dutch electronics giant, to develop the CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo. He did not mention Sony, not once, not even by accident. Across the convention floor, in a booth decorated with the sleek gray prototype of the Super Nintendo CD system, the Sony delegation stood frozen. They had spent years on this machine. They had engineered the sound chip, designed the disc format, and signed a contract that gave them control of the entire CD-based gaming market. And now, with one press release, they were erased. The heat from the stage lights felt unbearable against Ken Kutaragi's neck as Lincoln's words hit the crowd. The man who had secretly built the Super Nintendo's sound processor inside Sony, without his own boss's approval, stood in a silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. The prototype beside him, the machine that was supposed to launch a new era of gaming, suddenly meant nothing at all. This is the story of how a handshake between the world's largest electronics company and the undisputed king of video games collapsed into the most consequential betrayal the industry has ever seen. And by the end, you will understand why the PlayStation exists at all, and it is not for the reason you think. The question that hung in that Chicago convention hall was simple on its surface. How did a deal between two giants die in a single announcement? The answer, dug out of years of corporate maneuvering and quiet humiliation, reveals something far darker. Because the Philips deal was never about innovation, never about technology, and never about games. It was about fear, and fear, once it takes root in a boardroom, has a way of building its own destroyer. To understand what broke that day, you have to go back to the late 1980s, when Nintendo was not just a gaming company, but a fortress. The Nintendo Entertainment System had revived an industry left in ruins by the crash of 1983, and the company in Kyoto ruled with a severity that bordered on the absolute. Every cartridge that was sold, every game that was made, every developer who wanted to work with Nintendo had to submit to the same terms. Nintendo manufactured the cartridges itself, demanded payment in advance, and controlled the license with a cruelty that left publishers with almost no leverage. They set the price. They set the schedule. They decided who survived and who vanished. In one fiscal year at the height of this power, the licensing fees from those cartridges generated a sum so enormous it rivaled the entire revenue streams of whole countries in the industry. And this was the treasure that Sony, the world's most sophisticated consumer electronics company, believed it could taste. The partnership began with a secret so precious, it was almost unbelievable. A young Sony engineer named Ken Kutaragi had been quietly designing a sound chip for the Super Nintendo, working late at night in a small room, spending money he was not supposed to spend, all without official permission from his company. When Sony's top brass discovered what he had done, they were split between fury and fascination. Kutaragi had the sound chip working. He had proven it could outperform everything on the market. And Nintendo, hungry for the next technological leap, wanted it. So the deal was struck. Sony would build the Super Nintendo CD-ROM add-on, a machine that married Nintendo's legendary game library with a vast storage capacity of compact discs. The terms were precise. Nintendo kept its iron hold on the cartridge business, the source of all its treasure. Sony got the CD format, which meant Sony would own the future. And that was the fatal miscalculation because Nintendo's leadership looked at the contract and saw something they could not tolerate, a partner that would eventually control the entire disc-based market, who could dictate terms, who would no longer be a supplier but a sovereign. The word that should have stopped them was sovereign, because once a partner holds the keys to your future, they are no longer a partner at all. If you want to keep uncovering inversions like this, where the underdog reads the contract better than the empire, subscribe so you don't miss the moment the knife actually turns. Drop the phrase fatal miscalculation in the comments if you saw the cracks in this deal the moment Sony got the CD format. The fear in Kyoto was not about technology, it was about control. And the man at the center of that fear was Hiroshi Yamauchi, the imperious president of Nintendo, who had built the company's empire through sheer force of will and had never once believed that any partner was anything more than a temporary convenience. Yamauchi looked at Sony's engineering, at the prototype that was already being shown to developers, and he made a decision that would echo for 3 decades. He decided to destroy the deal, not to renegotiate it, not to adjust the terms, but to annihilate the relationship completely. The question was how, and the answer, when it came, was Philips. The Dutch company had no gaming expertise. They had no console, no game library, no vision for interactive entertainment that anyone respected. But they had one thing that mattered more than all of that combined. They had a format. The Compact Disc Interactive, the CDI, was Philips's own attempt to enter the digital home market, and it was a failure. But Yamauchi did not need a successful format. He needed a weapon. He needed a public announcement that would make the Sony partnership impossible, a deal so visible that walking it back would be a humiliation no corporation could survive. So while Sony's engineers were still polishing the prototype, still preparing their booth for the Consumer Electronics Show, Nintendo's lawyers were already drafting the Philips contract. Every public smile, every handshake, every promise of partnership was a lie built on a foundation of quiet, legal maneuvering in the background. And when Howard Lincoln stepped to that microphone in Chicago, holding a document that had been written months earlier, he did not just break a contract. He broke a corporation's trust in its own future. The Sony executives watched the announcement and understood, with a cold clarity, that they had been played. The prototype beside them had been in development for years. Kutaragi had risked his entire career on this project, and now it was dead, killed not by a competitor but by a supposed ally. Kutaragi walked back to his hotel room that night, the phones in the booth behind him ringing with reporters, asking for comments he could not give. He sat in the dark and called his wife, and the first words out of his mouth were simple, devastating, and absolute. He told her that he had failed. In a single evening, the man who had secretly designed the sound chip that made the Super Nintendo remarkable became the man who had bet his career and lost, and the company that had humiliated him did not even have the decency to warn him it was coming. That was the moment Norio Oga entered the story. The chairman of Sony, a man who had once publicly declared that he hated video games, who saw them as beneath the dignity of a company that made professional audio equipment, saw what Nintendo had done to his engineers and to his company's name. For Oga, the Philips announcement was not a business loss. It was a public execution. Sony had been humiliated in front of the entire electronics industry, in front of the press, in front of the world. The engineers he had allowed to chase this dream had been destroyed by a partner who smiled while holding a knife. And something in Oga broke. The disdain he had once felt for video games was replaced by a rage so pure it became a corporate mission. He ordered his engineers to take the work they had done, the prototype Nintendo had rejected, and build it into something of their own. The mandate was not for a partnership. It was for a reckoning. Sony would enter the gaming market, not to cooperate, but to go to war, and the weapon they would carry was the very machine Nintendo had thrown away. Kutaragi, the man who had called his wife in shame, was handed a new project with a brutal deadline and a budget that made his old secret work look like a school project. He built a team of engineers who understood what was at stake. They did not just want to build a console. They wanted to bury Nintendo. The PlayStation was born not from ambition, but from betrayal. Every accelerator, every chip, every line of code was infused with the memory of that stage in Chicago, of the silence that followed Lincoln's announcement, of the phone call made in a dark hotel room. And when the PlayStation launched in 1994, it did not merely succeed, it devastated. The CD format that Nintendo had abandoned to protect its cartridge treasure became the very thing that attracted the entire industry to Sony. Square, the developer who had created the Final Fantasy series, the crown jewel of Nintendo's library, defected to the PlayStation with its most precious creation. The Final Fantasy series had been synonymous with Nintendo for years. Its departure was a dagger inserted directly into the heart of Kyoto, and it proved that Nintendo's fear of losing control had cost them everything they were trying to protect. The machine born of betrayal outsold the betrayer by a margin so wide it changed the shape of the industry forever. By the end of that generation, Nintendo's cartridge-based Nintendo 64 stood isolated, a magnificent but lonely island in a sea of compact discs. You just watch Square walk away from Nintendo, taking the Final Fantasy crown with it. One decision that carved the battlefield into CD versus cartridge, winner versus isolated. If you want to see the same kind of inversion play out in markets where the big funds think they own the game, subscribe so you don't miss the next pattern. Leave a comment with one word. What was the real currency Nintendo lost that day? Control or flexibility? The engineers who had been humiliated on that stage in Chicago did not just win, they conquered. And the man who had called his wife to say he had failed, the one who had risked everything on a partnership that was destroyed in minutes, watched his creation become the most successful consumer electronics product in the history of his company. But the true cost of that day in 1991 was never measured in sales figures or market share. It was measured in the poison it left behind. Nintendo created its own destroyer. The company that taught the world how to make games created the machine that would eventually dethrone it, and it did so because it could not tolerate the idea of a partner who might one day become an equal. The question that has haunted every boardroom in Kyoto since that day is the one they have never been able to answer. What would have happened if they had simply honored the deal? What would the world look like if Sony had been allowed to build the Super Nintendo CD add-on? If the partnership had been allowed to mature? If fear had not won? The console war never ended. It just changed shape. The PlayStation that rose from the ashes of that betrayal became the soul of the industry, and the grudge that built it still radiates outward. Decades after the announcement that made it all possible, every success Sony has had since 1994 carries the ghost of that stage in Chicago. Every milestone, every blockbuster, every innovation is built on the foundation of a public humiliation that was never forgotten. And in the quiet of a hotel room, thousands of miles from Kyoto, a man who had once been told his dreams were over watched the impossible happen. He watched the machine he built in the shadow of his own defeat rise to rule the world. The question is not what Nintendo feared. The question is what we all fear when we look at a partner and see only a threat. Because the story of the console war is not really about consoles at all. It is about what we do when we let fear decide our future. And the answer written in the history of every machine we play today is usually destruction. Kutaragi's Revenge was not the only machine built from that betrayal. A second project, born in the same shadow of humiliation, moved through the industry under a different name, aimed at a different target. The engineers who had watched their CD dream die in Chicago did not all follow the PlayStation path. Some of them carried something else out of the ruins. They carried the fear itself. Those engineers dispersed into the wider electronics world, and each one of them took a piece of the lesson Nintendo had taught. They learned that a partner was not a partner. They learned that the handshake meant nothing when the lawyers had already drafted the escape. And they learned that the only way to survive in this industry was to own the entire machine, every chip, every format, every line of code. That lesson became the operating system of the modern gaming world. It is why every major console maker today fights for exclusives so fiercely, why they build their own online infrastructure, why they refuse to share their platforms with rivals. The trust that died in a Chicago convention hall has never been rebuilt. You can trace a straight line from that microphone to every bitter platform war, every exclusive title that vanished from a rival store, every developer forced to choose a side. The gaming industry did not learn to cooperate from the Nintendo-Sony split. It learned to dig trenches, and the cost of that lesson was paid by the players themselves. The console war that followed was not just a battle of machines. It was a battle of access. A child in the 90s did not get to play every game. They got to play the games their chosen machine allowed them to play, and the choice was made in boardrooms, not in living rooms. Nintendo's fear of losing control did not just create a competitor in Sony. It created a template for how the entire industry would treat its audience. The player became a hostage in a war they never agreed to join. But there is a deeper irony buried in this story, one that the architects of the betrayal never saw coming. The very company that sacrificed its partnership to protect its treasure ended up losing the thing it valued most. Not the market share, though that was lost too. The identity. Nintendo had once been the undisputed creative heart of gaming. They were the ones who taught the industry that games could be art, that a plumber could be a hero, that a princess could be the reason for an entire generation of adventure. Their name was synonymous with magic. And in the years that followed the PlayStation's rise, that magic began to fade from the public imagination. Nintendo became the company that said no. No to CDs, no to online, no to the future, no to the partners who would have helped them build it. The fortress they built to protect their treasure became their prison. Every machine they released after that carried the weight of the refusal. And yet the strange truth is that the refusal preserved them in a way their rivals never understood. The limitations they accepted, the walls they built, the formats they rejected, all of it forced a discipline that became their signature. While Sony chased raw power and third-party support, Nintendo's engineers had to wring brilliance from hardware that was always a step behind on paper. The constraints were not a handicap, they were a forge. And the games that emerged from that forge, the ones built on the bones of the CD era they had rejected, carried a polish and a purpose that the market had never seen. That is the paradox that the boardroom in Kyoto never resolved. The fear that pushed them to betray Sony also pushed them to perfect their own craft, to rely on nothing but their own imagination, to become the most stubborn and the most brilliant developers in the world. They lost the war for the future, and they won the war for the soul of the medium. But winning the soul was not the same as winning the industry, and the distance between those two things is measured in the silence of a convention hall. The players who had grown up with Nintendo, who had blown into cartridges and stayed up late chasing princesses, watched the center of gravity shift to a black disc and a new logo. The betrayal did not just create a competitor, it created a legitimacy. Sony's PlayStation arrived not as an interloper, but as a vindication, a machine that proved the CD format was the future, a machine that carried the resentment of a humiliated giant into every living room it entered. And the humiliation did not end with the launch. It compounded. Every major developer who signed with Sony was a message to Kyoto, a reminder that the handshake they had broken had been worth more than the treasure they had protected. The industry voted with its talent, and the talent chose the machine born of betrayal. There is a scene late in the story that captures the full weight of what Nintendo lost. It happens in a boardroom in Kyoto, years after the PlayStation's launch, when the executives sit down to review the numbers. The charts show the unthinkable. The company that had once controlled the entire industry now watches its share of the market shrink to a fraction of what it had been. And the numbers are not just numbers. They are a history of decisions, a ledger of every moment fear chose control over cooperation. Every time the fortress held firm while the world moved past its walls. The charts do not need to be explained. They are an autopsy. That autopsy on the boardroom charts deserves a closer look. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next time the numbers reveal the hidden knife. And in the comments, type autopsy if you recognize this pattern. The rigged game repeats, and we're here to decode it. What the charts cannot show is the human cost. The engineers who had poured years into the CD project, who had believed in the partnership, who had seen their work publicly erased, did not just lose a product. They lost a piece of themselves. And that loss, carried into Sony's new project, became fuel. The revenge engine that Oga ordered built was not just a machine. It was a monument to every engineer who had been told their work was worthless. And that is why it succeeded where every other console had failed. It was not built for profit. It was built for proof. Proof that the handshake meant something. Proof that the years of work were not wasted. Proof that the man who called his wife to say he had failed was wrong. Every line of code, every custom chip, every midnight debugging session was an answer to the silence on that stage, and the industry felt it. Developers who had watched the announcement from the other side of the world understood what Sony was building before the first unit shipped. They saw the rage in the architecture. They smelled the vengeance in the deadlines. And they wanted to be part of it. That is why Square made the decision that became the single most consequential defection in gaming history. Final Fantasy had been Nintendo's crown jewel for nearly a decade. The series had sold tens of millions of copies, had defined the role-playing genre, had made the Super Nintendo a cultural touchstone. When Square's leadership looked at the two machines, they did not see hardware, they saw futures. Nintendo's future was a cartridge, expensive to produce, limited in capacity, locked behind the same iron gates that had strangled the industry for a decade. Sony's future was a disc, cheap to press, vast in capacity, open to anyone who could code. The decision was not even close. And when the announcement came that Final Fantasy VII, would be a PlayStation exclusive, the news hit Kyoto like a second CES. The franchise that had been the symbol of Nintendo's creative dominance was gone, handed to the machine born of the Betrayal. The cartridge system that Nintendo had sacrificed its partnership to protect could not hold the game. That was the cruelest irony of all. The very reason Square left was the reason Nintendo had refused to change. The treasure they had guarded so fiercely was the treasure that could not hold the future. Final Fantasy VII was not just a game. It was a statement written in polygons and rendered in full motion video that the era of cartridges was over, that the era of fear was over, that the era of Nintendo's absolute control had been buried in the ruins of its own making, and the players, the children who had blown dust out of cartridges and waited for the logo to appear, followed the series to its new home. The loyalty that Nintendo had spent a decade building transferred in a single generation to the machine that had been built to destroy them. The PlayStation did not merely outsell the Nintendo 64, it redefined what a console could be, what a game could be, what an industry could be. And every unit sold, every disc pressed, every save file written was a vote against the fear that had broken the partnership in Chicago. But the deepest wound was not financial, it was philosophical. Nintendo had believed the control was the path to greatness. They had been the most controlling company in the industry, and that control had built an empire. Then they met a company that believed the opposite, a company that had been humiliated into openness, and that company won. The lesson was written in the market share charts, in the defection of Square, in the silence of a convention hall that had never been forgotten. Control could preserve a treasure, but it could not build a future. And the future belonged to the ones who had been forced to let go. The engineers who carried the fear out of the ruins, the ones who dispersed into the wider industry. They carried something else too. They carried the answer. They learned that the only way to survive was not to build walls, but to build bridges, not to hoard the treasure, but to share the game. And the players, the ones who had been held hostage in a war they never agreed to join, they were the real victors. The competition that the Betrayal created, the rivalry that forced every console maker to innovate, the relentless pursuit of better hardware and better games, all of it came at the price of a broken handshake.